Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The first time Amarachi felt her voice bloom, it was inside the tin-roofed sanctuary of living water assembly where the afternoon sun filtered through cracked stained glass panes and scattered color across the benches like God had spilled paint. She was 19, all elbows and shy smiles, a nursing school brochure folded in her handbag like a secret vow she wasn't yet brave enough to say aloud. Her father, Emmanuel, known by everyone as Brother Emma, because titles in church can swallow a man whole, swept the compound each morning before dawn and trimmed hedges into obedient shapes for the weekly services. Service is worship, he'd tell her, tucking a broom into his calloused hands, a scripture tucked into every sentence he loved. Bread on their table came from the church stipend and from odd jobs he picked up on the side, patching a roof here, fetching chairs there. So the church felt less like a building and more like a landlord holding a spare key to their lives. On Sundays, the pews filled with lace and perfume and expectation, and at the center of it all stood Pastor Enoch, tall, handsome in the way power looks handsome, voice smooth enough to iron out doubt, a smile that made people forgive the discomfort of how often the offering baskets returned for a second pass. Amarachi's voice threaded itself beneath his sermons like a quiet river beneath a road. She'd hum harmonies to herself while stacking hymnals, feeling something true rising in her chest, something unpurchasable. He noticed her during a youth rehearsal when the generator coughed, the microphones died, and their choir mistress, Mama Nwakago, asked for volunteers to hold the melody without amplification. Amarachi stepped forward only because silence felt heavier than fear. She sang "Great is Thy Faithfulness," and the notes came out clean, the kind of clean that makes people stop fanning themselves and listen. When she finished, the sanctuary carried the tail of her sound like smoke. Pastor Enoch, who had been crossing the aisle with his Bible and a leather-bound notebook fat with scribbles, paused, head tilted, as if the Holy Spirit had tapped his shoulder. "You have a rare gift," he said after rehearsal, with a softness that made the air tremble. "Gifts must be mentored." The word mentored shone like a coin in a poor girl's palm. He invited her to special midweek spiritual development, a phrase that felt like a door opening to a room with better light. Her father beamed when he heard. He'd always said Pastor Enoch had an eye for destiny. "Respect him," Brother Emma cautioned, as if respect were a blanket that could keep wolves from noticing lambs. "He is our covering." Amarachi nodded, grateful. How else does a daughter answer a father who spends his life sweeping the feet of the man he says God sent? Mentorship began as extra choir coaching, then scripture memory competitions, then private counseling about her future. The way water begins as a drop and becomes a flood by simply not stopping. He taught her breath control using a slow, close demonstration, his hands hovering near her ribs to guide the diaphragm, his breath warm with mint and power. He signed her up to lead a hymn the following month, telling her to listen only to him, because the Spirit's instruction sometimes confuses those who have not ascended. When he prayed over her, his words were oil slick, smooth, gleaming, difficult to hold. And she wanted so badly to be a vessel God could use that she learned to ignore the faint alarms going off in places inside herself that had never learned the vocabulary for danger. Pastor Enoch began to send her small tasks, arrange books on his office shelf, deliver letters to the deacons, stay after rehearsal, so he could explain how worship disarms principalities. Each instruction arrived wrapped in compliments about her diligence and warnings about envy from less anointed girls. At home, Brother Emma repeated the pastor's phrases, eager, proud, relieved that favor had found them at last, the way sun finds laundry on a line. Amarachi told herself the same thing every night. God was finally noticing her. She didn't know. How would she? That some men build ladders to heaven with the bodies of those who trust them, and that the higher you climb on such a ladder, the harder it is to admit it is leaning against the wrong wall. Rain had been threatening all afternoon, muscling up black clouds from the horizon and making the hibiscus behind the church fence shudder, as if they knew a rumor with teeth was coming. The power cut early that evening. The compound took on that hush peculiar to outages, where even frogs sound careful. Amarachi was in the choir vestry, folding blue sashes, when Pastor Enoch stepped in, water stippling his shoulders like tiny fingerprints, a leather Bible tucked under one arm. His phone face down, as if phones were the devil's favorite ear. "Daughter," he said, voice low enough to be mistaken for tenderness, "the Spirit pressed me. We must pray now before the warfare ripens." He closed the door with a click that made the room feel smaller than any room had a right to be. He spoke first about covering and altars, about how chosen vessels draw arrows, about how silence is a weapon that confuses demons. He opened to Psalms, read lines about refuge, then changed key and spoke about obedience, how Abraham's blessing was in his willingness to do what even his feelings could not applaud. His hand hovered over her head, then her shoulders, then stayed, heavy, under the holy pretext only power can impersonate without blushing. When she flinched, he quoted, "Be still and know." And when she tried to speak, he trimmed her words with, "Daughter, don't break what God is birthing." Somewhere between the thunder's belch and the rain's fury came the moment language fails to protect, that thin place where consent cannot breathe because fear has taken all the air. When it was over, he pressed a handkerchief into her palm like alms and said, "Say nothing yet. The Spirit works in secrecy." Morning delivered light without mercy. The world resumed the ordinary as if nothing had been stolen from it. Pastor Enoch sent her a text heavy with scripture and secrecy. "Your dry bones shall live." Remember, prophets suffer misunderstanding. God is doing a deep work. Guard it from mockers. "I will guide you." Amarachi stared at the words until the letters blurred, a sea where she could neither swim nor drown. Her body felt both hers and not hers. Shame is a clumsy locksmith. It fumbles, but eventually locks every door. She wanted to tell her father, to lay the whole night on the table between them, but Brother Emma had spent breakfast praising the pastor's rain-soaked diligence, how he still came to check the generator at 9 p.m. because shepherds don't sleep when wolves circle. She tried to speak and found her throat full of thorns. When she met Pastor Enoch later that week, he called what happened a test, a covering, a mystery of impartation. And each word did the work words do when wielded by a practiced liar. They rearranged the furniture of reality until you no longer trust the shape of your own house. He reminded her of her destiny, of how small people would not understand. "Do not tell anyone until I say," he warned, "lest they try to abort what heaven has planted. If there is a hell crafted for the righteous looking, it is paved with sentences like those." Life became a choreography of appearances. On Sundays, his smile found her across the pews, as if blessing were a private beam of light. He asked her to sing more often, a public favor that made private doubt feel like rebellion against God. After services, women clasped his hands and called him Daddy in the Lord, while he uplifted them with promises that sounded like gentle chains. Amarachi moved through the motions, rehearsal, school forms she could no longer focus on, errands that kept her orbiting his office. Once he gave her a small hamper, biscuits, tea, a bar of soap, for your father's faithfulness. She stared at the soap for a long time at home, as if it might wash a story off skin it never asked to carry. Brother Emma noticed her quietness and called it humility. He began to quote the pastor more often, as if proximity to a man's sentences could make a poor man rich. Amarachi tried to journal it all into a box that made sense, but ink kept turning into water, lines wavering under the weight of a thing she couldn't name. When she finally whispered to herself in the bathroom mirror, something wrong happened. Her reflection answered with her father's voice, "Touch not my anointed." In that echo, she learned the first rule of surviving in a house where the roof is reverence and the floor is hunger. What you cannot say becomes what you must carry. Her period did not arrive like a guest she kept setting plates for. 1 week tardy turned into 2, then 4, then a dread that moved into her like a bad tenant and rearranged the furniture without asking. The drugstore pregnancy test felt heavier than cardboard has ever felt. She read the instructions twice, then a third time, as if precision could bargain with fate. 2 lines bloomed like a betrayal on a field of white. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, counting her breaths, as if oxygen were arithmetic and could add up to a different answer. There are moments when a life narrows to a corridor so tight you forget what it is to turn your shoulders. She walked that corridor all day. By evening, she chose her father's room because truth, she had been taught, was a kind of honor, and honoring your father was a commandment that came with a promise. Brother Emma listened at first with his head cocked, eyes small with attention. "Papa," she said, voice shaking, "I am pregnant." His face did not change, only cooled, like water deciding to become ice. "Who?" The word was a blade, small and sharp. "Pastor Enoch," she answered, and the room, already narrow, became a bottle with a cork. He laughed, not the laughter of comedy, but the brittle sound a plate makes when it cracks in the sink. Then he quoted verses about strange women in snares, about witches who seduce prophets, about Joseph running from Potiphar's wife. "You will not bring a curse into this house," he said, and her entire body understood exile before he spoke it. He did not raise his hand to strike her. Brother Emma was not a hitter, but he lifted something heavier, the altar of his loyalty, and placed it over the truth until the truth stopped moving. He marched her through rain to the pastor's office, as if carrying an accusation to its own funeral. Pastor Enoch welcomed them with a surprise calibrated to look like innocence. He listened as Brother Emma stammered a summary, then turned to Amarachi with a tenderness that felt like a police light. "You know the devil fights bright stars," he murmured, eyes glistening with a grief he had rehearsed on 100 Sundays. "It is not her fault entirely," he told the father. "The spirit of lust can jump upon a vessel, especially when there are generational altars." He asked for permission to pray. He prayed loud, prayed long, prayed as if volume could drown memory, naming demons like a customs officer lists contraband. He wept, or seemed to. Tears are the cheapest currency in a house of performance. When he finished, he called her daughter again, and asked gently if there was perhaps a boyfriend she feared to mention. He suggested name, one of the boys in the youth fellowship who had carried instruments home for her once, offering the father a convenient story like a man offers a chair to someone who looks too tired to stand. Brother Emma seized it, grateful for a narrative that did not end his job. "Confess," he commanded Amarachi. She said the pastor's name again. He said hers like a curse. By the time they left the office, the story had already begun its public life. News in churches does not travel. It hatches, fully feathered, songs ready. Women who had envied her solos now shook their heads with a satisfaction as old as Eden. Men who had admired her deference now called it cunning. In the market, 2 girls muttered wayward as she passed, and one auntie clucked her tongue so loudly chickens would have answered. At home, Brother Emma packed her a small bag with the efficiency of a man extinguishing a fire before it leapt to the curtains. "Until you repent and name the boy," he said, "you will not sleep here." She sat on the step till night discovered her, counting all the things truth is supposed to set free, and finding that sometimes truth first chains those who carry it. She thought of running to the police. But how do you explain to a world trained to worship collars that one of them is a wolf? Pastor Enoch sent her a final message that night. Silence will save you. God hates those who bring his work into disrepute. And in that sentence, Amarachi understood another rule of surviving in a town whose God wore a man's face. The person who names the wound is often accused of drawing the knife. She curled around her bag and waited for a dawn that, when it came, would bring no relief, only a new day for her shame to stretch its legs. Sunday arrived with a kind of brightness that makes people believe God has written their names on the sky. Lace head ties bloomed like lilies. Ushers smiled with trained gentleness. The choir lifted a chorus that felt like polished brass. Amarachi stood near the back, trying to be smaller than her shadow. The baby inside her a quiet drum she couldn't silence. Pastor Enoch mounted the pulpit with his usual choreography of humility. Head bowed, one palm on the Bible as if steadying a ship, the other raised as if catching revelation midair. He preached on holiness, on vessels of honor, on how Satan sent agents into churches to smear leaders. The words were a net, and the congregation leaned forward, eager fish. Mid-sermon he shifted, voice dropping into that intimate register he reserved for family matters. He said there had been an attack, A young woman under demonic influence, spreading lies against God's servant. Murmurs rose like heat. He asked for the girl to come forward so they could pray. Head swiveled, eyes landed on Amarachi like stones. Her feet moved before her mind agreed. Perhaps some part of her believed prayer could still be a door out of a room that had no windows. She reached the altar, and the air changed, as if someone had opened a fridge in a warm kitchen. Pastor Enoch placed his hand on her head, light enough to look gentle, firm enough to feel like ownership, and said he forgave her for yielding to familiar spirits. What followed was not prayer. It was theater with scripture sprinkled over it like powdered sugar on a bitter cake. Deacons formed a ring behind her as if guarding a crime scene. Women leaders chorused fire, with a zeal that mistook volume for power. Pastor Enoch commanded spirits of lust to leave, commanded lying tongues to be silenced, commanded altars in her father's lineage to break. When Amarachi tried to speak, he pressed the microphone to her lips and announced, "Manifestations can sound like confessions. Don't be deceived." The congregation nodded, grateful to be instructed on what to think. Her father stood 3 rows back, eyes glassy, with a desperate faith that needed his boss to be innocent more than it needed his daughter to be safe. When he finally stepped forward, it was to hold Amarachi's elbow as she swayed, not to defend her, but to support the narrative that she was under attack, and the man touching her was her helper. Every amen felt like a nail. When the pastor declared her delivered, the church broke into applause, the way people clap at the end of a tense play. He hugged her briefly, camera phones catching a tableau that would become proof later, and whispered, "Do not repeat lies the devil put in your mouth." She smelled mint and cologne and a future shrinking to a point. After service, the gossip began its afterlife in the courtyard, where doctrine often dissolves into appetite. "These girls of nowadays," one woman said, balancing a Bible and a bag of puff-puff, always wanting attention. Another patted Amarachi's shoulder with a practiced pity of those who enjoy their superiority, advising her to stay far from the altar until she is fully free. The youth leader suggested a week-long fast to starve the flesh, and 3 aunties offered her a list of herbs for cleansing. Not one person asked her what had happened behind a locked door. Her father avoided her eyes, shaking hands with men who told him to be strong. Their words were condolences for a death that had not yet occurred, the death of a story where a daughter is believed. Pastor Enoch strutted between clusters, dispensing blessings and chuckles, pausing only to squeeze a toddler's cheek and pose for a photograph with a visiting businessman. Before Amarachi left, he called her aside and told her he had arranged counseling with his senior mother in the church. "Walk in wisdom," he said, the phrase sounding like a leash hidden in velvet. She stepped onto the road, the sun harsh now, the world loud with engines and laughter and the rustle of plastic bags. Behind her, the church generator coughed back to life for second service. The note that had once bloomed in her chest when she sang was gone, as if someone had found it and snapped it between 2 fingers. She pulled her scarf tighter and walked home to a house that no longer had room for the truth or for her. The argument at home did not take long. Exile rarely needs an essay, only a sentence with enough weight. Brother Emma stood by the doorway with a small bag he had packed, 2 dresses, a wrapper, toothbrush, a cracked Gideon's Bible. He did not shout. His silences had always been more terrifying than thunder. "You will not bring this shame here," he said, placing the bag in her hands like a baton passed in a race he would not run. Amarachi tried to explain again, voice tripping over details that felt both too much and not enough. "He is the Father," she whispered. "I did not choose this." Her father's jaw clenched. "A man of God," he scoffed, and the tone turned man of God into a fortress she could not scale. He opened the door and gestured toward the road as if indicating a bus stop. "Go and pray for mercy. When you are ready to confess truth, the door will open." The door closed. It was a simple action, the kind that happens every day, but a plate shifted under her life with that click. She stood outside for a long minute that felt like a parable, then walked because there was no alternative, but standing until darkness made a home of her and mosquitoes wrote scriptures on her legs. She tried her aunt first, Auntie Philomena, devout and sharp-tongued. who listened, squinted, and sighed. "You wanting to choose between my church and you?" The question was a verdict. A neighbor shook his head, muttered economics, and shut his gate. By evening she found herself at the bus station, where concrete benches have learned to cradle the tired without asking for testimony. Night at the station had its own liturgy. Hawkers selling last buns at mercy prices, drivers arguing about fuel, children asleep on their mothers' wrappers, while a distant radio narrated a football match no one could see. Amarachi tucked her bag under her head, the wood hard but honest, and watched neon flicker on puddles until the lights decided to go. The baby turned, an elbow or a knee testing the boundaries of her refusal, and she laid a palm on her stomach, surprised by the tenderness that leaked through the cracks of her anger. A woman selling roasted corn pushed a cob into her hand with the shy generosity of the poor. Amarachi tried to refuse, failed, and ate with the quick gratitude hunger teaches. Somewhere near midnight, a preacher began a loud impromptu sermon about repentance, his voice slicing through the weary air. She pretended not to hear, then laughed once, a sound without joy. Rain threatened but did not arrive, sitting like a heavy thought on the black edge of the sky. When sleep took her, it was not because comfort had softened its hands, but because exhaustion had held her head still and closed her eyes. She dreamed of a stage and a river. On the stage people clapped while she tried to sing without words. In the river something small floated away, and she could not tell if she was relieved or drowning. Morning was grease and noise, and the sour sweetness of unbrushed teeth. The day so bright it felt like mockery. She washed her face at a public tap and tied her scarf tight. Pride is a luxury hunger cannot afford. Amarachi began knocking on doors, shops, kiosks, a tailor's shed, asking for work of any kind. Everyone had narratives ready-made. The pastor's altar call had done its work. "Ah, you," the tailor said, measuring tape around his neck like a collar. "You need deliverance, not employment." A salon owner smirked and asked if she would shave her head as a sign of repentance. A man selling phone cases offered a job that required closed doors and cash left on bedside tables. She left before he finished the sentence. The baby inside shifted again, as if turning its back on the world too. By sunset, she had earned nothing but dust on her slippers and a deeper understanding of how fast communities become courts. She returned to the station because it was the only place where her presence did not rearrange furniture. As darkness thickened, a choir rehearsal drifted on the wind from the direction of the church, the sopranos lifting a hymn she had once loved. She lay down and turned her face to the wall, the notes like ants crawling over a memory she could not swat. When sleep came, it arrived with the certainty of a debt collector. She owed tomorrow everything and had no receipt. Labor announced itself like a rumor you try to ignore until it repeats itself loudly in a room full of people. At first it was only a low ache, a belt tightened 2 holes too far. By noon it became a tide, pulling back to give her false hope, and surging to remind her she was not in charge. A bus driver's wife noticed her breathing and hustled her into a kiki, bargaining the fare down with the authority of a woman who had given birth twice without losing her manners. The clinic was small and honest, its paint peeling in places like a poor man's laughter, its nurses moving with the efficient tenderness people learn when there is more need than equipment. A midwife named Nurse Beezy took Amarachi's hand and told her to squeeze when the waves came. "You are safe here," she said, not as a slogan, but as a working plan. The room smelled of Dettol and determination. Amarachi counted ceiling cracks between contractions, reciting psalms she once loved like they were phone numbers she did not want to forget. The pain was a country with no map, and she crossed an inch by screaming inch, swearing at God, then apologizing, then swearing again. Through it all, a small steady part of her mind kept whispering the pastor's phrases with the detached cruelty of memory, covering obedience, chosen vessel. She told that voice to drown. When the baby finally slipped into the world, the cry was thin at first, then insistent, a stranger demanding entry. The first thing she noticed was the weight, lighter than she had imagined, yet unbearably real. Nurse Beezy wrapped the child and placed him on Amarachi's chest where the heat of him startled tears she had been refusing. "A boy," the nurse smiled. the word boy carrying a tenderness that did not know the story it was entering. The pediatric officer came, checked reflexes with gentle taps, shone a small light. He frowned, then softened his face before he spoke the way people do when they know truth can bruise. His pupils aren't responding, he said softly. Tests, referrals, big words that sounded like furniture, too heavy for this small room. Amarachi stared, as if concentration could force the word sight to grow in his eyes. Sometimes, the doctor continued, children are born without vision. It does not mean they cannot live fully. The sentence were hope, like a borrowed coat, useful a little loose. Amarachi's stomach hollowed with a free fall of questions. Why, how, what kind of future? Where will money come from? What if not? Somewhere far away she heard a baby in another room wailing, and a mother laughing, with that shocked joy new life provokes. The sound crossed her like a shadow. She touched her son's tiny fingers. He gripped her like a person with a plan. For a moment something unclenched. Then the flood returned. Visions of doors closing, of tongues wagging, of Pastor Enoch's mouth forming a public prayer and a private smirk. The baby, mouth rooted, hungry as only beginnings are. She adjusted her wrapper and fed him, surprised by the animal clarity of the act, the way bodies know what doctrine forgets. News travels even where no one has airtime. By afternoon, a women's group from the church arrived with a nylon bag of provisions and the spiritual audit no one had requested. They prayed loudly, their words banging against the ceiling. Every spirit of darkness out. One suggested the blindness was a sign, another called it a test. A third asked if Amarachi had visited strange altars. Nurse Beezy manufactured errands to stay near, her presence a thin shield against zeal without knowledge. When the women left, a small white envelope remained on the bedside table. Money from a generous brother. The note had no name, but the handwriting walked like someone she knew too well. Amarachi stared at it until anger heated her cheeks, then told the nurse to buy diapers with it, because anger does not purchase necessities. She tried her father's number, and it rang into the careful silence of the rejected. She imagined walking to the church with the baby and putting him in Pastor Enoch's arms in front of a camera, then imagined the narrative being spun before she reached the gate. A mad girl seeking attention, a merciful pastor feeding a beggar. She lay back and watched dust float in a sunbeam, each speck bright for a moment before it fell out of the light. What will you be called? Nurse Beezy asked, swaddling the child tighter. The name rose before Amarachi had time to edit it. Chisum, she whispered. God is with me. The words tasted both true and impossible. That night, when the ward finally quieted and someone's radio hummed a lullaby off-key, Amarachi pressed her lips to her son's forehead and made two vows that contradicted each other even as they were born. To love him because he was hers, and to resist him because he was a mirror she could not bear. Outside, rain rehearsed on the roof, gathering itself for a night that would be long and, for the first time in months, full of more than fear. At first, Amarachi tried to convince herself that Chisum's blindness was only a temporary storm, a passing darkness that medicine could clear. She visited clinics with peeling paint and doctors who frowned into folders before shaking their heads gently, each shake like a nail driven into hope. Money was the bigger sickness. She had none. She sold the only gold earring she owned, the one her late mother left her, to buy medication that promised improvement but delivered nothing. With each fruitless trip, the weight in her chest grew, and with it the whispers. People in the neighborhood began to see her as a walking parable of disgrace. Old women, their teeth stained with cola, shook their heads as she passed and murmured about God's judgment. Younger ones, barely older than her, stared openly at Chisum's pale, unresponsive eyes and crossed themselves like she carried contagion. She knocked on shop doors, offering to sweep floors or run errands, but employers glanced at the baby strapped to her back and declined. We cannot pay someone who will be leaving every time her child cries, they'd say, but their eyes said something harsher. You carry bad luck, and we don't want it. The rejection bled into her self-worth. Each no felt heavier than the last. Each slammed door another reminder that she had been stripped of everything except the responsibility she never asked for. She began to watch Chisum in moments of quiet, searching his face for a reason, any reason, that could make sense of the life she now lived. Sometimes she found tenderness there, a small yawn or a grip of her finger that almost melted her resolve. Other times, all she could see was the invisible chain binding her to a life she did not choose. At the market, one vendor muttered that Amarachi should take the child for deliverance, to have the demons cast out of his eyes. Another suggested she take him to a river goddess shrine, since church prayers haven't worked. The more she heard such talk, the more she felt the bitter seed of resentment sprouting roots in her. She wanted to believe Chisum was innocent, but the exhaustion of poverty and the unending shame began to cloud her view. She had no friends left. Even her former choir mates avoided her, afraid to be seen with the girl who accused the pastor. One night, after returning from yet another failed job hunt, she found herself staring at Chisum longer than usual. He lay on a raffia mat, his tiny chest rising and falling in sleep, his lips pursed in a peaceful pout. For the first time, she let the thought in fully. If he had never been born, I would still have my life. The thought frightened her even as it comforted her. She pushed it away, then it returned, more convincing each time. That night she dreamed of a wide river, its current strong but inviting, carrying burdens far from their owners. When she woke, her heart pounded as if she had run miles. She fed Chisum quietly, her hands trembling not from fatigue, but from the slow, creeping realization that she was starting to see the river as more than just a dream. It was beginning to feel like a solution. The day the thought became an action began like any other. Hot sun, heavy air, and the smell of roasted plantain drifting through narrow alleys. By evening, though, the weather turned. Thick clouds rolled in from the east, and the wind carried the promise of a hard rain. Amarachi had spent the day walking, her sandals cutting into her heels, and she returned home with nothing but dust in her throat. Chisum's cough had worsened. It rattled in his small chest like pebbles in a gourd. She had no money for medicine, not even enough for the cheapest syrup. As she sat in the dark, the idea that had been stalking her for weeks stepped fully into the room. The river. Her breath came faster. She wrapped Chisum in a faded blanket, tucking it around him the way she had done 100 times before, except now her fingers lingered longer, as if memorizing the feel of him. The rain began just as she stepped outside, fat drops splashing against the red earth. She walked quickly through the winding path toward Eek Bridge, her head bowed, as though ashamed to meet the eyes of the storm. The bridge was old, its wooden planks slick with algae and time, the rails rusting in places where paint had long given up. Below, the river churned, its voice rising in welcome or warning. It was hard to tell which. Amarachi stood there for a long moment, the rain soaking her headscarf, her arms trembling. Chisum whimpered softly, perhaps sensing her unease, perhaps only reacting to the cold. She whispered to him, her voice cracking, "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. You deserve better than this life, and I can't give it to you." She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, him or herself. With a trembling breath, she set the basket on the edge, nudging it forward until the current took hold. It bobbed once, twice, then began to drift. She watched it move away, her vision blurred by rain and tears until it became only a small shadow in the water. Her knees gave way, and she crouched there, gripping the rail as if it could hold her guilt in place. The river carried the basket around a bend and out of sight. She stayed until the cold became unbearable, until the rain began to ease, until she could almost believe she had dreamed the whole thing. Then she walked home through streets that looked unchanged, but to her every corner felt heavier, every sound sharper. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her mat, staring at the ceiling, listening for a cry she would never hear again. Downriver, where the current slowed and reeds grew in green tangles, Nkem was hauling in his evening nets. A widower in his late 30s, he lived in a small mud brick house by the water, alone since his wife died in childbirth 2 years earlier. His life had become a rhythm of solitude, mornings casting nets, afternoons mending them, evenings cooking fish stew for one. That night, as the rain began to thin, he noticed something caught among the reeds, a basket, swaying gently in the water. Curious, he waded in, the mud sucking at his ankles, and pulled it toward him. Inside lay a baby, wrapped tightly in a damp blanket, his eyes closed but breathing steady. Nkem froze, his heart thudding. He knew the river's temperament well. It did not often return what it took. This was no accident. The baby stirred, opening eyes that did not focus on anything. Nkem recognized the look. He had seen blindness before in a neighbor's child. But where others might have seen a burden, Nkem saw something else, a reason. He thought of his wife's last words, how she wished they could raise a child together. He thought of the empty mat in his house, the quiet that sometimes felt like it might swallow him whole. He wrapped the baby in his fishing jacket and carried him home, the warmth of the small body seeping into his chest. By the time he lit a fire and set a pot of water to boil, he had already decided. This child would be his son. He would name him Chisum, a name he remembered from his mother's tongue. God is with me. It felt right, as though the river had returned not just a life, but a promise. Over the next few days, Nkem fed Chisum goat's milk from a bottle, sang to him in the evenings, and fashioned a small crib from woven palm fronds. Word spread through the village about the baby the river had chosen to spare. Some said it was a blessing, others whispered that it was an omen. Nkem ignored them all. He had decided this boy was his, and no one would tell him otherwise. He registered the birth with the local authorities, claiming to have found the child, and listed himself as the father. The paperwork was thin protection, but it was enough for him. When Chisum's tiny hand gripped his finger for the first time, Nkem felt something shift inside him, a quiet vow that no river, no circumstance, and no cruelty of the world would ever take this child from him again. From the moment Nkem took Chisum in, the rhythm of his life transformed. Mornings no longer began with a lonely slap of nets against water, but with the soft gurgle of a baby who seemed to sense his father's presence even without sight. Nkem learned quickly that raising a blind child meant teaching the world through touch, sound, and scent. He guided Chisum's tiny fingers over the rough texture of fishing nets, the smoothness of polished shells, the cool dampness of freshly caught tilapia. He whistled distinct tunes for different times of the day, one for breakfast, another for bath time, another for bedtime, until Chisum could navigate the small house by sound alone. People in the fishing village watched with cautious curiosity. Some whispered that Nkem was cursed to raise a river child, while others admired his courage. But Nkem's pride in Chisum's progress was louder than their gossip. By the time Chisum was 5, he could walk confidently along the shoreline with a sturdy cane Nkem carved from Iroko wood. He knew the exact number of steps from the house to the water, could identify people by their footsteps, and recognize the sound of his father's laughter from as far as the market square. Nkem never used Chisum's blindness as an excuse to keep him sheltered. "The world will not soften for you, my son," he would say. "So you must learn to walk on its stones without cutting your feet." This philosophy meant teaching Chisum how to carry small baskets of fish to sell in the market, how to haggle for fair prices using only tone and persistence, and how to sit at the fire and listen for the subtle boil that meant a stew was ready. Chisum absorbed everything eagerly, his quick mind turning lessons into habits faster than most sighted children could manage. Yet, despite their closeness, there were questions Nkem could not answer. Chisum often asked why he couldn't see the river or the faces of the people who greeted him. Nkem would answer with gentle metaphors, telling him that sight wasn't only with the eyes, that some people see more clearly through their hearts. But sometimes, when Chisum fell asleep, Nkem would sit quietly by the fire and think about the day the river delivered the boy to him. Who had placed him there? Why had they done it? And what pain must have been in the hands that let him go? He didn't have the answers, and in truth, he wasn't sure he wanted them. Chisum was his son, and that was the only truth that mattered to him. But the unspoken questions lingered like mist over the water, and Nkem knew they would eventually drift into Chisum's life, whether he wanted them to or not. By the time Chisum turned 17, the boy who had once clung to Nkem's hand was now a young man with a sharp mind, an unshakable memory, and a stubborn will to prove himself. Nkem had saved every spare coin from his fishing to send Chisum to the village's small primary and secondary schools. where his teachers were at first unsure how to handle a blind student. But Chisum made it impossible to underestimate him. He could recite entire chapters of history textbooks after hearing them read once, solve complex math problems in his head, and debate with his teachers on legal issues he had heard on the radio. When a visiting education officer came to the school for an inspection, she was so impressed with Chisum's abilities that she recommended him for a government scholarship for visually impaired students. The scholarship would cover his tuition at a university in the city, where he could study law. The day the acceptance letter arrived, Nkem sat by the fire turning it over in his hands, reading each line out loud to Chisum with a voice thick with pride. Law, Chisum repeated, tasting the word. A voice for the voiceless, he added softly. It was a phrase he had picked up from a radio program, but it resonated deeply. The idea of defending people against injustice, of speaking where others had been silenced, felt like more than a career. It felt like a calling. Nkem, though secretly worried about sending his son into the bustling chaos of the city, refused to let fear stand in the way of opportunity. If you have to shout to be heard, shout, he told him. But never forget who you are or where you came from. When the day came for Chisum to leave, the entire fishing community gathered to see him off. Women pressed small food parcels into his hands. Men clapped him on the back, some muttering blessings, others joking that a big city lawyer would one day return to defend them over fish market disputes. Nkem stood apart, watching his son with a mix of pride and longing. As the bus pulled away, Chisum leaned out the window, waving toward the sound of his father's steady voice calling his name. For Nkem, the sight of that bus vanishing down the dusty road felt both like losing something precious and planting a seed that would one day return bearing fruit. He didn't know what awaited Chisum in the city, but he knew his son carried with him the strength of a fisherman's son and the quiet resilience of a child who had already been rescued from a river once. City life was a storm of sound and scent for Chisum, blaring horns, clanging metal from construction sites, the smell of roasted suya mingling with exhaust fumes. At first, he moved cautiously, counting his steps, mapping routes in his mind, relying on the kindness of strangers. But he quickly adapted, using the same sharp memory and awareness Nkem had cultivated in him. University life challenged him in new ways. Dense legal texts, complex debates, and professors who were both impressed and skeptical of a blind student aiming for the courtroom. Chisum turned skepticism into fuel. He recorded lectures, memorized case law, and spent nights in the library listening to old trial recordings, absorbing the cadence and strategy of seasoned lawyers. In his second year, Chisum took on a volunteer role at a legal aid clinic that served the city's poorest residents. It was there that he met Musa, a street vendor accused of stealing a politician's wristwatch during a rally, claiming the accusation was a ploy to silence him because he had refused to pay protection fees to local thugs connected to the politician. Chisum listened closely, sensing the truth in Musa's voice. With the supervision of the clinic's senior lawyers, Chisum helped prepare the defense, meticulously cross-referencing witness statements and pointing out inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. During the trial, he stood in court for the first time, his voice steady, his questions precise, dismantling the false narrative piece by piece. When the judge pronounced Musa not guilty, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs of admiration. Newspapers the next day carried small headlines about the blind student lawyer who had freed an innocent man. Chisum didn't care about the publicity. What mattered was the look on Musa's face when he walked out of the courtroom a free man. That moment lit a fire in Chisum that nothing could dim. He realized that while he could not see his opponents' faces, he could see their lies more clearly than most. His professors began to treat him with a new respect, and the legal aid clinic offered him more challenging cases. What Chisum didn't know, what neither he nor Nkem could have imagined, was that his path was already curving toward the man who had set his entire life in motion, the pastor who had left him in darkness before he even had a chance to see. It started with a voice on the radio. Chisum was in the legal aid clinic, sorting through case notes, when the midday news carried a breaking story. A women's advocacy group was petitioning for an investigation into a prominent pastor accused of sexually exploiting multiple women in his congregation. They didn't name him at first, only spoke of his vast following, his charitable works, and his reputation as a man of God beyond reproach. But Chisum recognized the name the moment it was finally spoken, Pastor Enoch. The syllables landed in his mind like the thud of a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through places in his memory he had never been able to explain. He didn't know why the name bothered him more than it should. All he knew was that it felt personal in a way he couldn't articulate, a disturbance in the air that made his hands still over the papers in front of him. The advocacy group's director, a sharp-voiced woman named Iphioma, came to the clinic 2 days later, looking for volunteer lawyers willing to take on what she described as a lion in a pulpit. She laid out the preliminary evidence: testimonies from 5 women, bank records showing hush money transfers, and a history of public shaming of accusers from the pulpit. "He's untouchable," she admitted, "but so was every man we've ever put behind bars." Chisum listened in silence, fingers tapping against the table in thought. Something about the details, the manipulation through prayer, the twisting of scripture, the use of public humiliation to control victims, stirred a restless unease in him. Still, he didn't volunteer immediately. He told himself it was because his course load was heavy, because final exams were approaching, because he had already taken too many cases this term. But deep down, there was another reason. He felt the pull of this case in his bones, and he wasn't sure he was ready to follow it. That night, he couldn't sleep. The name Enoch repeated itself in his thoughts, pairing strangely with fragments of childhood questions he had never been able to answer. Where he came from before Nkem, why his father never spoke about finding him, why his earliest memory was the smell of river water. Around midnight he called Nkem, hoping for comfort, but the conversation stayed on safe topics: fishing yields, the rainy season, when Chisum might visit next. He didn't mention the case. Yet even as they spoke, he knew the decision had already been made. By morning he walked into the clinic, found Iphioma, and said simply, "I'll take the case." She didn't know it, but in that moment, Chisum had begun walking toward the one man whose sins had shaped his entire life before he could speak his own name. Taking the case meant immersing himself in the stories of women who had been groomed, silenced, and left to bear their pain alone. Iphioma handed him a folder thick with affidavits and transcripts. Chisum spent hours in his small dorm room, listening to recorded testimonies and dictating notes into his Braille device. Some women described being counseled in private rooms where prayer turned into touch. Others spoke of threats, spiritual damnation, public shaming, or the loss of their family's livelihood if they spoke out. One woman's account made his hands clench involuntarily. She had been called to the altar and accused of being possessed, forced to kneel while the pastor prayed over her, his hand heavy on her head, her father in the congregation watching without stepping forward. Chisum replayed that clip 3 times, trying to understand why the image it painted felt like something he'd already seen before. He didn't have the memory, but the feeling was visceral, like a shadow brushing against his skin. His strategy meetings with Iphioma and the rest of the team were intense. The pastor had powerful allies, politicians, wealthy business owners, and other church leaders who saw any attack on him as an attack on the faith itself. The opposition's lawyers were experienced and ruthless, already dismissing the victims as liars seeking attention, and painting the accusations as a coordinated smear campaign. Chisum approached the work like navigating an unfamiliar shoreline, careful, deliberate, marking every step. He cross-referenced the victim stories, looking for overlaps in timing, methods, and threats. He discovered that several of the women had been expelled from their homes or cut off from family after speaking out. It was a calculated pattern: isolate, discredit, destroy. The more he uncovered, the more he felt the weight of the case pressing into him, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who could no longer pretend he was standing at a safe distance from wreckage. One evening, as the team debriefed at the clinic, Nkem called unexpectedly. They hadn't spoken in weeks, and his father's voice was warm but probing. "You sound tired, son. This case must be important." Chisum hesitated before admitting it was about a pastor accused of things he didn't finish describing. There was a pause on the other end, too long to be casual, before Nkem said, "Be careful with pastors, Chisum. Sometimes they carry storms you don't see coming." The words lodged in his mind long after the call ended. It wasn't a warning that made him want to step back. It was a warning that made him feel he had been walking toward this storm his entire life. The process of building the case turned into a labyrinth of conversations, late-night interviews, and fragments of testimony that needed to be stitched together into a story the court couldn't ignore. Chisum's method was patient. He let each woman speak at her own pace, never rushing, never filling silences with his own voice. He understood that for some, this was the first time their story was being believed. In one cramped apartment, lit only by a single flickering bulb, he met a woman named Amarachi. She spoke with a voice both brittle and strong, telling him how she had been thrown out by her father after accusing Pastor Enoch of impregnating her as a teenager. She said she had given birth to a blind son, and her voice faltered. "I wasn't strong enough," she whispered. "I left him where I thought God might take him back." Chisum sat very still, his heart pounding in his ears, as if the air in the room had turned to water. Something in her tone, in the pauses between her words, reached into a place in Chisum that had never been touched before. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask for details yet. Amarachi wiped her eyes and forced herself to finish. She told him about the congregation turning against her, the public deliverance that felt like humiliation, the years of scraping by. She had come forward now, she said, not because she expected justice for herself, but because she couldn't bear the thought of other girls enduring the same fate. Chisum thanked her, his voice steady, but inside, questions tumbled into each other. A blind son, left near water. The timeline she described would make him almost exactly his age. He filed the thought away, afraid of what it might mean if he looked at it too closely. When he returned to the clinic, he didn't tell Ifeoma about the connection he suspected. Not yet. He focused instead on tightening the case, establishing patterns of abuse, confirming financial records that tied church funds to hush payments, compiling statements from witnesses willing to testify in open court. But Amarachi's voice stayed with him, her confession replaying in his mind as he lay in bed that night. He turned the name over in his thoughts, Amarachi, a name that felt both foreign and familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Outside his window, the city hummed with distant traffic and stray dogs barking. Inside, his own thoughts roared louder, the pieces of his life beginning, at last, to drift toward each other like debris on the same current. The first day of trial drew a crowd large enough to block traffic on the street outside the courthouse. The air was thick with murmurs, the smell of sweat and dust mixing with the faint perfume of church women who had come in solidarity or suspicion. Pastor Enoch arrived in a gleaming black SUV, stepping out in a crisp white suit, Bible in one hand, his other hand raised in a benediction to the people gathered. His entourage of deacons and bodyguards flanked him, their polished shoes reflecting the sun. Inside, the courtroom buzzed as reporters adjusted their cameras and members of his congregation prayed aloud for his vindication. Chisum entered quietly, cane tapping steadily on the tiled floor, Ifeoma guiding him to their table. Though he could not see the man across the aisle, he could feel the weight of his presence, the careful stillness of a predator who believes himself untouchable. The prosecution opened with a stark narrative, weaving together the testimonies of multiple women whose stories bore the same scars, private counseling sessions that became abuse, threats of hellfire if they spoke, public shaming to destroy credibility. The defense countered with practiced ease, painting each accuser as bitter, unstable, or financially motivated. Their lead attorney, a man with a booming voice and theatrical flair, gestured dramatically as he accused the women of trying to bring down a servant of the Lord. The tension was palpable, the spectators dividing into two camps, those who saw the trial as long overdue justice, and those who saw it as a witch hunt against a man they revered. Chisum sat listening, his face calm, but his fingers tightening on his pen with every dismissive word the defense spoke. When it was their turn to call witnesses, Ifeoma led the questioning while Chisum directed strategy. passing her notes in neat, braille embossed sheets. The first two testimonies went as expected, raw, painful, but strong under cross-examination. Then the court clerk called the next name, and Chisum's breath caught, Amarachi. Her voice filled the room, trembling at first, then steadying as she recounted how she had been accused of seducing the pastor, cast out by her father, and left to fend for herself with a pregnancy she never wanted. The courtroom shifted in its seats. This was not a sanitized story, but one rooted in humiliation and survival. Chisum felt a strange pull in his chest, an echo of something old, as if every word she spoke was unlocking a door inside him he had not known existed. Cross-examination was brutal. The defense lawyer tried to rattle Amarachi, asking why she had waited so long to speak, insinuating that she had fabricated her story for attention. But she stood firm, answering without hesitation. "Because I was a child," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Because no one believed me, not even my father. Because I thought if I stayed quiet, I could forget. But I never forgot." The lawyer smirked, shifting tactics. He brought up her child, pressing for details. That was when the truth slipped through, shaky, unplanned. "My son was born blind," she said, her eyes glistening. "I couldn't feed him. I left him in a basket by the river, hoping someone would save him. I prayed every day that God would send him a father better than the one who gave him life." The courtroom gasped. Even the judge's gavel could not quiet the ripple of shock. Chisum sat frozen, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. The air around him seemed to thicken, every sound muffled except her voice. Amarachi didn't notice him. She was lost in her own reckoning, speaking as if the confession were both a wound and a release. She described the bridge, the storm that night, the sound of the river swallowing the basket. She did not cry, not yet, but the weight in her voice carried more than tears could. The judge urged her to stick to the relevant details, but the story had already lodged itself in every corner of the room. For Chisum, it was not just relevant, it was personal in a way he could no longer deny. When she stepped down from the witness stand, Chisum fought to keep his composure. He had always known he had been found near the river, and Nkem had told him that much. But to hear it from her lips, to know the woman who had carried him inside her was sitting in the same room, it was too much to process. Ifeoma whispered for him to stay focused, but the words slid past him. For the rest of the day's proceedings, he heard the trial like an echo, distant and distorted. He didn't approach Amarachi during the recess. He didn't trust himself to speak without the entire court hearing the question burning in his chest. "Are you my mother?" The second day of her testimony began with more resistance from the defense, but Amarachi held her ground, each answer sharpening the picture of Pastor Enoch as a manipulator cloaked in holiness. She recalled the night visits, the twisted scripture, the way he smiled as the congregation turned on her. Every word was a blade, cutting through the myth of his purity. Chisum listened, the details fitting too neatly with the testimonies of other victims, yet carrying a unique weight that bound them together in something deeper than legal strategy. He noticed the pauses in her speech, the same rhythm he had unconsciously mirrored for years. Even the slight tremor when she spoke certain words felt achingly familiar. During a recess, Chisum stepped outside to clear his head. The courthouse courtyard was noisy with reporters, but he found a corner away from the chaos. Amarachi emerged a few minutes later, walking slowly, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed in his direction. She hesitated, then approached. "You're the young lawyer," she said, her voice softer now. He nodded. Up close, he could hear her breathing quicken. "You remind me of someone I once knew," she added, and for a moment he thought she might say it, might name the river, the basket, the night. But she stopped herself, as if the words were too heavy to lift just yet. They stood in silence until Ifeoma called him back inside. The rest of the day blurred. Witness after witness spoke, but Chisum's focus drifted. He thought of Nkem, of the way his father's hands had always been steady, of the unshakable love that had carried him from the river to manhood. And now here was Amarachi, his mother, almost certainly, testifying against the man who had stolen her dignity and nearly destroyed her life. He didn't yet know how to reconcile the two truths, that she had given him life, and that she had also let him go. But one thing was clear, this case was no longer just about justice for strangers. It was about confronting the shadows that had shaped him before he even had the chance to open his eyes. The final morning began without fanfare, no choir of thunderheads, no theatrical sunbeam. Just the courthouse yawning itself awake, the metal detectors beeping, the guards swapping shifts, and a line of reporters anchoring their microphones like fishermen staking claim to a bend in the river. Inside, the spectators' bench bristled with quiet, nervous energy. Women from the advocacy center gripping each other's hands. Church elders wearing suits that looked heavier than conscience. Curious citizens coming to see which would blink first, power or truth. The defense opened with its last flourish, a summation that pirouetted between slander, conspiracy, and assault on the faith. Their lead counsel pacing like a metronome, he begged the court to consider the good works of a man whose ministries had fed orphans and built boreholes, as if clean water could rinse blood from a page. When the judge nodded, the lawyer's voice grew honeyed, leaning on miracles, prison visits, scholarships, his index finger carving halos in the air. If the law were a stage, he wanted the curtain to close on pathos. Then it was Chisum's turn. He rose slowly, cane leaning against the table, fingers smoothing a braille page that was more scaffolding than script. His voice did not try to summon thunder. It was river steady. He did not attack belief or salvageable goodness. He separated faith from the man who wore it like a costume. He walked the court back through time, thread by thread, the private counselings, the public humiliations, the hushed transfers hiding in ledger margins, the matching phrasing in victims' accounts that no committee could stage direct. He spoke of how predators learn to choreograph rooms, so that the only person who looks mad is the one telling the truth. He ended not with eloquence, but clarity. Your lordship, sight is not a requirement for seeing. What matters is whether we will look where the evidence points, not where charisma gestures. The courtroom felt different after that, not converted, not conquered, just balanced, as if the floor had been tilted all trial, and someone at last had put a wedge beneath the truth. The judge called a recess, then returned with a face that made noise fall off the benches. He read slowly, each counter rung down, which the pastor's image climbed into the place where men go when costumes are confiscated. Guilty on sexual assault. Guilty on intimidation and witness tampering. Guilty on unlawful use of church funds to obstruct justice. The defense tried to stand. The judge's palm indicated they should practice obedience for once. Two officers stepped forward. For the first time in months, Pastor Enoch's smile deserted its post. A ripple spread through the pews. Some gasped, some wept. A few clapped until the gavel reclaimed the room. The judge reserved sentencing for a subsequent date, but ordered immediate remand. As the bailiff collected phones that had sneaked out for a legal recording, a breathless quiet landed. In that hush, a thin older man rose from the back row, hat clutched like a confession. Brother Emma spoke without being asked to, voice shaking, words stumbling over decades of misplaced loyalty. He said he loved the church more than courage, that he chose salary over daughter, that when a nameless envelope arrived at a clinic years ago, he recognized his pastor's handwriting and pretended it was God's provision, not hush money. I betrayed my child, he said, and the last word crumbled. There was no legal need for his confession, not today, but truth often arrives late and uninvited, the way rain starts with a single fat drop that still somehow counts as rain. Outside, everything sped up, photographers jogging backward. Microphones thrust forward, sentence-length opinions handed to cameras like leaflets. Amarachi reached the steps and then couldn't descend. Her legs were remembering bridges. She turned, and there, 3 paces behind, stood the young lawyer who had arranged the pieces of her broken past into a picture a court could recognize. The world thinned to a straw through which only the essential could pass. She knelt. Not for spectacle, not for penance performance. Knees simply found the ground because they could not hold the weight of the words. I'm sorry, she said once, and then again, the repetition untying Knott's language had left in her. I was a child when I needed help, and when I became a mother, I failed at the first request the world ever made of me. Chisum did not attempt to lift her. He let apology stand at full height. A horn blared, a reporter whispered, "This is it," as if history needs commentary to become itself. Then a familiar voice cut through the noise, smelling of river mornings, and would smoke even from a distance. Nkem. He had traveled overnight, called by that invisible thread fathers and sons share that outlives secrets and kilometers. He reached for Chisum first, not with a bare hug, but with the firm press of hands that have taught storms how to behave. "My son," he said, not loud, not theatrical, just the truth in its most nutritious form. Chisum turned toward Amarachi's breath. "This is my father," he said, and the sentence rearranged the air between all three of them. Brother Emma shuffled forward, hat twisting. He did not know where to put his apology, so he set it down everywhere, at Amarachi's feet, at Nkem's feet, at the feet of the boy he once vowed to protect but never met. "If forgiveness is a road," Chisum said at last, "I will walk some of it with you. But it begins with both of you asking him," he touched Nkem's hand, "for permission to join the future he rescued." The crowd, hungry for drama, did not understand the holiness of a boundary set kindly. But the river did. It has always known the difference between surrender and release. Sentencing day arrived weeks later, the city's gossip having burned through its first supply of adjectives, and resigned itself to
as
nouns.
Kayamaka
The
reached
judge
the
read
altar.
impact statements
Emeka
first,
extended his hand,
voices that trembled
and she took it
cracked
with no
and
trembling.
also rang like
The
iron.
vows were simple
One
but
woman
sacred.
spoke of years
"I promised to
never
never
ask
ask
you
you
to hide your
that came
scars,"
dressed
he
in
said.
Sunday clothes.
"I promised to love
Another
the woman
said she
who
still
rose from
flinched
fire
when anyone
and to walk
quoted
beside
certain
her
scriptures,
even when the
as if
world
holy
forgets her
words
journey.
had been weaponized
When it was
and might go
Kayamaka's
off again,
turn,
she
when
smiled.
it was Amarachi's
And I
turn,
promised to never
she did not
pretend to be
speak
perfect
as
again.
martyr or
I
monster.
promised to let
She
love
described
seed
a
all
young
of me,
herself who
not
mistook
just
the
the healing
grooming for
parts.
God. Shame
After the
for
ceremony,
sanctification,
as the crowd
and
gathered
silence
around
for
them,
safety.
a journalist
She did not
from a
request
small
mercy
women's
for the
man
magazine
who
approach.
had taught her those
You
errors.
could inspire
She
millions,
asked the court
she
to be
said.
merciful to
Do
the
you have
next
a quote
girls
for young
by
women
making
watching?
an example of him.
Kayamaka
When the
looked
judge
at Emeka,
pronounced 30
then
years,
at the sky.
there was no applause.
Then she turned to the
Only
camera
a
and
collective
said,
exhale.
"Don't let
Like
anyone
a room
tell
where
you that your
trapped
scars
bird has
disqualify
finally
you
found
from
the
love,
open window,
from purpose,
Pastor
or from
Enoch
joy.
in cuffs,
The person
attempted
who
one
truly
last
sees,
performance.
you will never
Chin up,
ask you
an
to shrink.
almost smile,
The
a
picture
hint
of her
benediction
speaking
with
her
his scarf
cuffed hands,
visible and a
until
smile
a guard's
radiating
hand on his
strength
elbow
went
edited
viral
him
in
into
the weeks
reality.
that followed.
On the courthouse
She was
steps,
called the Bride of
cameras
Bravery
sought commentary
by local
from
media.
everyone.
But
the
titles
person they
didn't
wanted
matter
most,
to her.
Chisum,
That night,
only said,
as she lay beside
"This
her
case was
husband,
never
Emeka whispered,
about my beliefs.
You know, I've never
was
seen
about the
anyone
evidence."
fight for their own soul.
Then he
like
added
you did.
almost gently,
She smiled
"And about
in the
showing
dark.
other boys
I
and
wasn't
girls
just fighting
that
for myself,
nothing you
she
survive
replied.
makes you unworthy
I was
of
fighting
justice.
for every girl
The
who
afterlife
thought beauty
of a verdict
was their
is
only
not
value.
neat.
It
And
arrived
as sleep
gently
gently took her.
installments.
The last
The
tears
church
she shed
trustees
wasn't from
dissolved the
pain,
ministry,
fear,
and
or
under
grief.
court order, it was
Transferred
from gratitude.
the building to a
The
non-profit
kind that only
coalition
comes when you
that turned
survive
the
a
sanctuary
fire
into
and
a
come out with your
vocational
crown
hub
still
by day
intact.
and a counseling center by night. The baptismal font held laptops. The pulpit became a reading desk where girls drafted resumes and boys learned to unlearn the theology of entitlement. Ifeoma's organization set up a legal aid kiosk in the old usher room. The first poster on the wall read, "You are believed here." Brother Emma resigned from what remained of the church maintenance job and took work sweeping a different kind of floor, the corridors of a school for visually impaired children, where he learned tap-tap rhythm from white canes and humility from kids who met the world without sight but not without joy. He asked to start at the bottom of the pay scale. The principal, who had heard his courtroom confession on a neighbor's radio, refused and paid him fair. Amarachi did not disappear into private comfort. She volunteered at the center on intake days, the hardest ones, where the newly brave come to speak and their throats betray them. She learned to pour water, to press tissues into palms at the right moment, to sit with a story until it remembered it could walk. She also learned to apologize in languages beyond words, consistent presence, unglamorous tasks, and the courage not to rush forgiveness like a deadline. As for Chisum and Nkem, their lives did not sprout wings and fly above ordinary weather. They ate ordinary stews, argued about ordinary things. How many cases in a month is too many? Whether a boat engine should sound like this or that, and returned to the river one evening with Amarachi and Brother Emma walking half a step behind. They had brought no basket this time. The river would never again be asked to carry what people could. Instead, they carried a small wreath woven from palm fronds, threaded with for shells and Kem had saved, and a ribbon from a choir sash Amarachi once wore. Chisum used his cane to find the scarred plank on the bridge where nails had kept quiet about history. The water moved as water always moves, untampered by verdicts, unimpressed by headlines, and yet, somehow, more companionable than before. "We cannot return what we took," Amarachi said, voice steady, "but we can refuse to take again." She set the wreath down and let the current adopt it. Brother Emma cleared his throat and faced Nkem, the apology this time landing not on stone steps or in crowded halls, but here, where it might root. "You raised my grandchild into a man who sees farther than I ever looked," he said. "Teach me how to stand where I should have stood." Nkem nodded, a small motion with a large future inside it. Chisum turned toward the music of their breaths. "People speak of blood as if it were the only map," he said, smiling in the direction of the man who had pulled him from reeds and the woman who had finally pulled herself from shame. "But the river taught me another cartography. Who shows up when the water is cold? Who stays when the current turns? Mother, I forgive you. Grandfather, walk with us. Father, thank you." They left the bridge together, not healed in the way fairy tales promise, but mending in the way real life delivers, thread by faithful thread. And somewhere behind them, the wreath kept traveling, proof that some things you set loose do not drown. They learn the route home and bless the banks as they go. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.